Jacko Willink. Great name, isn't it? Jacko. Jacko Willink. He's a Navy SEAL officer. I recently came across a TED Talk that he gave, and I like TED Talks because they're inspiring and there's little things I can learn from them as they speak, and obviously hope to appropriate in my own preaching. But Jacko Willink gave this TED Talk about the most important lesson he's learned in his life. And then, of course, like many life lessons, it happened when something really bad happened. So here he is, a Navy SEAL officer commanding a bunch of troops, and they're in Iraq. It's 2006, and they're in a city. I can't remember the name of the city, but it was the epicenter of the conflict at the time. You know the city, but well done. Look at you. You could just come up here and give the homily, Hyatt. But here he is, and they're in the city, and a battle breaks out. And he describes it as the fog of war. You know, in the fog of war, there's all this confusion, and it's this experience of evil and obviously violence and everything that isn't good in humanity, right? And so this happens, and the battle is done, and everything finally settles down. The fog of war lifts, and Jacko's heart falls because he realizes that they have not been fighting terrorists. They've been fighting themselves. It was an us versus us battle, and they didn't know it. He called it the mortal sin of war, to be fighting yourselves and not know that you're doing it. And of course, there's a big problem, a big tragedy. A couple of people, I think only one person died, but many were injured. And so he says to his commanding officer, "We were fighting ourselves today." And they say, "Shut down all operations, get together, talk about it. I want you to put together a report so that we can learn why this happened, so it never happens again." And Jacko hears that someone's going to be fired. That's what those words meant to him. Someone's going to have to take responsibility for this and be fired and lose their job. And so he begins to put together his report, and he pays attention meticulously to every mistake. And he assigns blame to each mistake. He's like, well, this soldier was responsible for that mistake, and this one for that one, and so on and so on. There's just one problem. He could never figure out who was at fault. Who was the main person that should shoulder the blame for this crisis? Until finally he had an epiphany. He's like, aha, it's one person. One person is at fault for this. So he goes to his soldiers, he says to them, "How did this happen?" And one soldier at a time raises their hand. "Jacko, it's my fault, sir. I made this mistake, and if I hadn't done this, this wouldn't have happened." And then another soldier, "My fault, sir. If I didn't do this, this wouldn't have happened." Before he knew it, everyone had raised their hand and shared a mistake that they believed they had made that could have prevented this crisis. And he looks at his soldiers and he says this, "No, it's not your fault. It's mine. I'm your commanding officer. I should have seen these mistakes. I should have prevented this crisis. The fault is mine." And so his commanding officer comes and he meets with them and he gives his report to them. He certainly tells them all the mistakes that were made, and he says, "I take responsibility. I take ownership. This was my fault." And he said it was the hardest thing he ever had to do because no one likes to admit it's their fault. He said his pride was hurt, his ego was bruised, but he did it. And he expected to be fired. And wouldn't you know it, he got promoted. He got promoted because they said to him, "Jacko, we know now. If there's ever a crisis, if there's ever a thing that happens and there's a mistake made, you will own up to it. We need people like you who will recognize and take responsibility for their mistakes. And even more important, your soldiers trust you because they know that you're not going to put blame on them for things that you've done wrong. And even more important, they will take responsibility themselves for the mistakes they've made." What Jacko learned was this: when members of a team take ownership of their mistakes, that team has the potential to solve great problems. We've got a lot of problems in our world today, don't we? We've got a lot of problems. We just have to look at this week. I think I'm not alone in sharing grief and sadness for these 19 lives, young lives lost in the Uvalde shootings. And I think I'm not alone in wondering, why does this keep happening? Why? And I'm probably not alone in being worried, because I'm sure many young parents here, you're worried about your kids at school, and I'm worried about my mom, because she's the school secretary at SJV. You know, she's the one that buzzes people in. It's a terrifying world that we're living in. And we got problems, and we got to figure it out. And I hope we learn from Jacko. See, what we like to do is we like to spread blame around. We've already seen it this week. You know, we've taken notice, and this young man, this shooter, he on Facebook for the past year has been posting different things about how he's going to do this, and no one said anything. And then, for whatever reason, a teacher left a door propped open at the school. And then the security officer wasn't there and drove past the shooter on the way. And then for whatever reason, the police waited an hour to go in. I'm not trying to spread blame. I'm showing you how we've already done it this week. And not only that, we have some people who say, you know what, if the political right just figured it out and made gun laws, we wouldn't have this mess. And we have some people who want to blame the political left. You know what, if they would just admit it's not just guns, there's a deeper spiritual sickness going on. There's a deeper problem. And then we have other people who want to blame the church. I went on Facebook and I clicked on Bishop Okoviak's response to this and his statement from the shooting, and people on our Grand Rapids Diocese Facebook page were blaming the Catholic Church. Because if we really cared about life, we would speak more about gun violence. I'm not looking for sympathy for the church. What I'm pointing out is we blame and blame and blame. We got to stop doing it, because we'll never solve our big problems. We've got to start taking ownership of the mistakes we all make so that we can have solutions to these problems. You might be wondering, why the Feast of the Ascension? Am I talking about this? Well, one, because sometimes big things happen in our world I don't think I should ignore in a homily. And I hope you never feel this way. This is not Father Stephen's political soapbox. My hope and prayer is always to give where Jesus gives us hope in our world. That is my main focus. And I believe Jesus does give us that hope this weekend. What happens first? Jesus is raised to heaven, and there are the men of Galilee. They're standing there, and they're looking up at him, and they say this: Lord, are you going to finally restore the kingdom of Israel? In other words, are you going to finally end all sin, all death, all destruction, all the things that tear us apart? Are we going to finally live in unity, love, and peace with you in heaven for all eternity right now? Because that's what they saw him going to heaven as a sign of, that he's not just going up, but he's going to take us with him. That's what they wanted, the restoration of the kingdom of Israel. And of course, Jesus says, yes, but not yet. It's still time for you to do something. And of course, there they are standing with their heads in the clouds, and the angels come and they say, Men of Galilee, what are you doing? Go. Go into the world. It's time for you to take extreme ownership of the mission. It's time for you to take extreme ownership of the mission. You're now supposed to go into the world and to share the good news of Jesus Christ for others. I think if we learn to do that, if we learn to take extreme ownership of our mistakes, of our lives, of the mission of Jesus, we can start to see these problems get solved. You know, I have a buddy who he's a Protestant pastor today, and he put on his Instagram this message, and I think he was just frustrated. And he said, it's time to stop praying and time to start doing. Well, I respectfully disagree with that statement. Here's why. Because prayer matters. Absolutely, it does. Prayer can make a change in our world. It can convert hearts. Prayer can help people heal and transform. But prayer can never be separate from action. We also have to do things that bring Christ's love and grace into our world. If you're looking for how to do that, Mother Teresa gives us the best advice. She says this: if you want to change the world, pray as if everything depends on God. And love and act if everything depends on you.